it's Ben here. I want you to imagine for a minute that you're driving along a road at 80 kilometres an hour. Maybe you're doing that right now while you're listening to the podcast. Think about how quickly things pass you, how the white line spins along the road. Maybe your window's down and you can feel the velocity of the wind coming through it. Now, imagine a cyclist rides straight out in front of you and you have no time to react, swerve or slow down, and you hit the cyclist. Well, that's exactly what happened to Nick, except he was the cyclist. In this episode, I talked to Pr Nick and Brenda, who recall the story of what happened, his horrific injuries, and the amazing things that God did for both of them. It's a powerful story.
Pr Nick and Brenda, welcome to Revival on the Air today.
Thank you.
So we just had a lovely dinner at your house here in Canberra. Thank you so much for having Emily and I over. It's been a wonderful night so far. We're going to talk a little bit about a story that started back on the 11th of March. So tell us what happened on the 11th of March.
So that was a Saturday, and I was on my regular morning bike ride, which I've been doing for several years.
So this is a road cycle bike?
Yeah, it's a road bike.
Paths.
Yeah, road bike, and I go around the local golf club, which is mostly off-road, and I've been doing that for several years. There's a small section of road that I cross over. It's a very busy intersection, 6-lane intersection, and I go across that on the bike at a very slow speed, and I got hit by a van travelling at 80 kilometres an hour. How do I know that? Because Brenda got a copy of the police report, and the fellow said that he was ensuring, because there's a speed camera on the intersection, he was making, and it was marked at 80 k's, he was making sure that he was under that speed limit.
Right. So how did that happen? Were you crossing the road the wrong way? Was he crossing the road the wrong way?
So what happens is that I go round the golf course. It takes me about 20, 25 minutes. And then the last section of my ride is to cross over this intersection, which then leads into our suburb. And then I just go on the footpath then to my home. And then that's my morning ride. So it's about 30, 35 minutes or so.
But according to witnesses, Nick crossed on a red pedestrian light.
Right.
And none of us know why he did that, because we've been doing it so regularly, at least 5 days a week for years. But anyway, that's where he was. So the van driver had a green light and wasn't expecting Nick to come out in front of him.
And where were you, Brenda, at this time?
Well, I'd already completed my bike ride and I'd come home.
And do you normally ride together, or?
Well, normally I set off first because he's faster than I am.
Yeah.
So,
and I'm busy preparing the breakfast, of course,
that's
for
right.
us.
He prepares the breakfast before he leaves. And so I'd arrived home, and then I waited for Nick to come, and I thought maybe he'd had a flat tyre or something else. Maybe gone to Bunnings on the way, and then I realised that maybe something else had happened. So then I rang his phone, which quite often he didn't take, and when the phone was answered, it was by James at the Canberra hospital.
Right.
And he told me that Nick had been brought in by ambulance and that he was in quite a serious condition.
And how did that must have been a massive shock to you.
Well, it was a shock, and I did burst into tears, but I think, I just knew that the Lord had everything under control, even though I didn't know the circumstances. And, I rang one of my daughters, and her husband came and collected me. And on the way over in the car, we had prayer. And that was I felt really good after that. And then when we got to the hospital, most of the family was there by that stage.
You're right.
And we all had more prayer together.
Yeah.
And I just felt real peace about the whole thing. And when I started talking to the doctors, I realised how serious the accident was.
Yeah.
And he'd actually had 2 ambulances at the site, and he'd lost, I think, 1.5 litres of blood because he'd had a fractured femur.
Yeah.
And they apparently bleed a lot. So he'd had to have...
So is that an internal fracture?
It was an internal fracture,
yeah.
And so he had to have 3 units of blood as soon as he got to the hospital.
Yeah.
And at one stage, they didn't know who he was. He was unidentified. But at some point, Nick managed to answer their questions and tell them who he was.
Yeah. So do you often in times of accidents like this, we don't remember everything. What do you remember about what happened?
I don't remember anything about it.
Right.
It's interesting because Brenda and I, some time later, walked over that intersection, if you like, the scene of the crime, and I have absolutely no memory whatsoever of that. So it's all a bit out of body for me.
Yeah, right. And do you remember the day? Do you remember anything?
No, I don't remember any of that. In fact, it was probably a week and a half after the accident when I was back. So I spent nearly a week in ICU.
Yes.
And then they transferred me back to the general ward. And it wasn't until a few days after that I actually started to wonder where I was. You know, it's like I woke up out of a dream.
Right.
And of course I asked them, where am I? Because I thought initially I was in Calvary Hospital, which is the hospital on this side of town. And they said, no, you're actually in Royal Canberra Hospital and you've been in a very serious car accident. And I said, what? What do you mean? And then they pointed to all
the injuries,
damage in my body and so on. So I had to, admit that obviously I was in some sort of accident. But in terms of me understanding or appreciating that, absolutely none. And it was extraordinary because witnesses, just to go back a little bit, witnesses saw me punted about 5 or 6 metres into the middle lane of the intersection when I got hit by the van. And fortunately, all the other cars around me were able to stop, so I wasn't run over. And 3 people, including the driver of the van, ran to my aid and commenced CPR as they thought I was dead.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I wasn't. And soon after, as Brenda said, 2 ambulances and the police arrived, and they assessed my condition as very serious.
Yeah.
Now, if anyone's seen TV shows, reality shows like ambulance or accident shows, there's this terminology they use called the Glasgow Coma Scale, or GCS, which, as I said, is a tool that they use in the medical profession to determine the extent of consciousness in trauma patients. It assesses patients according to responsiveness, eye-opening, motor and verbal responses. The highest GCS score is 15, the lowest is 3. A score of 15 means you're fully awake, responsive and have no problems with thinking or memory. A score of 8 or below means you're in a coma and likely to have severe head injury. A score of less than GCS 5 is associated with an 80% chance of being in a lasting vegetative state or death.
Right.
I was assessed as a GCS 4 and taken to Canberra Hospital, which is the major hospital.
Yeah, right.
So it was really extraordinary. I mean, I was unconscious, completely aware of that. And as Brenda said, she had this conversation with hospital staff and so on.
And so, Brenda, how quickly did they start telling you about the extent of his injuries?
Oh, immediately. So by that stage, all the family was gathered around the bed and we were talking to one of the trauma doctors, and he basically went through a very, very long list of all the things that they had identified with Nick. And so essentially he had 3 bleeds on the brain. He had broken his shoulder blade, his collarbone. He'd broken most of his ribs on the left side. And they weren't just broken in one spot, they were broken in a number of spots.
Right.
He had a punctured lung.
Which was probably as a result of the CPR that the people were doing, because I had the broken ribs, they just went straight into my lung.
He had the broken femur.
Fractured skull.
Yeah, the fractured skull and a broken neck.
Yeah.
And later on we found out.
So where was the break in the neck?
The break in the neck was right up near the bottom of the skull.
Yeah, right.
And actually it can be quite dangerous, and it can fact result in permanent quadriplegia if it's not handled properly. So I had to wear this
collar around my neck to sort of protect my spine, I guess.
Yeah, for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And it was problematic because Nick's memory was, because of the head injury, he really couldn't retain anything. His short-term memory was shot for really the first month or so. Yeah. And doctors were quite concerned because that is a sign of a, severe brain injury.
Yeah. So you're in the hospital. They're assessing all his injuries.
Yep.
They're telling you all of the things that are wrong.
Yeah.
What was the prognosis for him? What were they telling you about his recovery and what his long-term life would be like?
Oh, well, I think they were sort of fairly circumspect at that point. I did ask them, I said, how serious is this? And the doctor, he actually paused for quite a long time. And then he said to me, well, he's not dying yet, were his exact words. He was a terrific young doctor, trauma specialist. So that was a bit chilling to hear that. And we realised, when he went off to intensive care, that he was actually in quite a serious state.
Yeah, right.
Well, remember they asked you for a copy of my power of attorney and an advanced care directive.
Yeah.
So that gives you an idea of
So
how
they
serious
did that,
they
and
thought
then
it was.
and I took a day or two to get it back to them.
Yeah.
And by the time I took it back, they said, "Oh, look, we don't need it now."
Yeah,
So
right.
that was really, wonderful to know.
Yeah.
So he was just, obviously in a very, very serious state, really. And he had just one-to-one care, obviously, in intensive care. Couldn't do a thing for himself. He had tubes and drains and all sorts of things coming in and out of him. And he was on very strong drugs just to deal with all the pain. And then he had lots of contusions and bruises and whatever all over him. So it really was a miracle, number one, that he survived the accident.
So getting hit at 80 kilometres an hour, it's just extraordinary, right?
It is extraordinary. And I must admit, when I've been sitting at traffic lights and watching cars going past in an 80 zone, I'm truly amazed that Nick's here, alive and well.
Yeah. You got some statistics
and
there.
Yes, I have. One of my daughters dug out some statistics, and the survival rate in a crash between a car and a pedestrian, there is a 10% chance of survival if hit by a car at 50 kilometres per hour. So that's pretty low, and that was from the New South Wales Centre for Road Safety. And then in a head-on crash between two vehicles, there's a 20% chance that a driver or passenger will survive at 90 kilometres per hour. So that, in a modern car with airbags.
Yeah, wow.
So it's quite sort of chilling when you think of what could have happened.
Yeah. And that incremental difference when you go 50, 60, that's significant in terms of impact. And
it's logarithmic. It's not linear.
That's right.
And so therefore it's huge.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. I remember hearing about it. Somebody told us, I can't remember, someone close to you. We were trying to, I think it might have been Penny and Chris, and they told us about it, and we obviously immediately started having some prayer. And I remember at the time thinking about it. I said, I've been hit by a car at 35 kilometres an hour and ended up with all sorts of trauma. I can't imagine what 80 would have been like.
No.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I'm just very grateful too to the Lord that I wasn't there to see it, because I think it would have been replaying in my brain for an awfully long time.
It's funny how you think about these things, and I think it's probably a good thing I was hit by a van, which is virtually a vertical surface. If it was a car, which has a very narrow thing, I could have been very badly damaged, particularly from the waist down.
So we're very badly damaged, mate.
No, I mean permanently. Which was.
But you know what? It wouldn't have mattered, right? You could have been hit by a truck.
That's right. The Lord still would have.
Exactly. Yeah. The angels were there, Nick.
Yeah.
You were fine.
Yeah, it's amazing. And in a sense, it's probably a blessing that I don't have a memory of it, because they had to assign a student nurse to sit by my bed for 24 hours a day, because what was happening was I was trying to pull this brace off my neck because it was so uncomfortable. And I don't have any memory of that.
But he'd forget that he had a broken neck and that he, that neck brace was keeping him from, possible quadriplegia. Yeah. And the other thing that we spoke to a neurologist about 3 weeks ago, and Nick had this, the particular fracture that he had was to the foramen magnum, which is essentially, it's a name for the big hole, which is at the bottom of the skull where it joins onto the spinal cord. And he said that's a really nasty sort of fracture to have. And not only could it cause, paraplegia or quadriplegia, but it can actually interfere with the way that your tongue works, your ability to swallow, and, on a permanent basis. And there's nothing they could do about that.
Yeah.
So he was very fortunate. He's had none of those issues.
So what was going on for you at the time, Brenda? I mean, obviously you were praying. I assume the fellowship was praying. Were you freaking out? Were you worried? Were you stressed out? Were you...
Well, none of those, funnily enough. I just had that peace of the Lord, just plain and simple. And I really wasn't worried about Nick. I knew that I obviously appreciated, the situation was quite dire. But I just had a real peace about the whole thing, and it was a tremendous comfort to me to know that the fellowship was all over the place. People were praying for us, praying for our family, and I think that's just what upheld the family, really, particularly during the first week was probably the most difficult, only because it was so exhausting. Every day I would go into the hospital and try and be there at 7 o'clock in the morning, because that's when all of the specialists would do their rounds. So in the ICU, and you'd have the brain doctors, the neurologists, you'd have the orthopedic surgeons. Yeah. We had the heart and lung people would come by. I'm just trying to think who else.
Psychologists for my...
the neuro people. So there are 4 or 5 different groups of specialists that would be trailed by doctors and nurses, and they would come in and assess him. And there was a lot to deal with. That's why they had all these teams. So the Canberra Hospital is actually the preeminent trauma hospital in the region, and there's nothing like it between here and Melbourne. Even in Sydney, they don't have a hospital like the Canberra Hospital, where they've got all of the trauma specialties in one spot. And I must say they were excellent. We received excellent care, and they were very thorough and very professional. But it just demonstrated to me just the seriousness of his many, many injuries.
And so that peace that you talk about, I mean, that's pretty incredible, because this is not a man you married yesterday. You guys have been married for 48 years, still madly in love with each other. But this is not an insignificant thing to not have to worry about. And here you have this amazing peace that doesn't actually make any sense, does it?
No, it doesn't make any sense. It really is sort of beyond, comprehension. But it was just wonderful, and that peace really carried me through for the whole time.
And there was also the practical support.
Oh, there was practical support, but the peace was that was wonderful. And I stayed close to the hospital for the first few weeks at my son's house. So he was, literally up the hill. And it was really great because I could, I just able to pray morning and night. And the Lord just really sustained me, because even though you still have that, you've got the peace of the Lord, it's still quite overwhelming physically and mentally. And in that respect, you're dealing with a lot. And then I was dealing with a lot of interested people that wanted to know how Nick was going with updates and all the rest of it. So, it was just an amazing thing, that piece. Yep.
And what about the practical support?
Yeah, we had a freezer full of meals, frozen meals.
The people in the fellowship made for you?
Yeah, it was very overwhelming.
Yeah, it was a bit overwhelming and very humbling.
Yeah, it was. It was great.
We talked about my memory not being very good. Pastor Godfrey from P&G rang me while I was in hospital and prayed for me over the phone, since the message that I had this accident had gone up to P&G and elsewhere. And he prayed with me over the phone. I don't remember it, but apparently I prayed in tongues as well with him. Apparently I interacted with him and prayed in tongues as well, but I don't remember it. It's extraordinary. Yeah, so there you go.
Yeah, wow. And so let's talk about what the Lord's done for you since that time. So you're in intensive care for a week. How much longer were you in hospital?
I was in hospital for 11 weeks.
No, not 11. It was just under 2 months that he was in hospital.
Yep.
Okay.
Trust me.
I defer to your...
Just defer to the expert.
You're the expert.
Yeah. Who can actually remember that period of time?
I can. Yeah, Nick's, as I say, Nick, for the first month, Nick had, he just couldn't retain any information.
Yeah. It felt like 11 weeks, didn't it?
It did. It felt like 11 weeks. And I had a psychological nurse come in and ask me a series of questions. And then the following day, she would ask me what I remembered from the previous day, and I couldn't. So it was a bit embarrassing.
Yeah.
But I gradually started to get better, and I started to remember what she said the day before, and eventually she said to me, "Well, you're well on the road to recovery, and I don't need to give you any more questions each day." So that was a bit of a breakthrough.
So that's a long way from that initial assessment, that score of 4, where it's long-term, long-lasting brain injury.
That's right.
That really would affect your quality of life quite significantly.
Oh, it would have.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, one other injury which Brenda didn't mention was that I had a blood clot from my wrist to my shoulder in my left arm, and when I
That's a long. That's like half a metre.
That's
is.
right.
Yep.
And I was on blood thinners, and I was also on a opioid-based painkiller, and I was still taking the painkiller and the blood thinners, and the expectation was that I would probably have to do it take them at least until Christmas time, possibly even longer.
So this is March, 11th of March.
So 9 months
That's
it would have
right.
been.
So end of April was when I got out.
But one of the specialists that we've been to recently, an orthopaedic surgeon who just deals in arms essentially, she said to Nick that when we went for an assessment and she ordered an ultrasound just to get a bit of a snapshot of what was happening with the blood clot.
Yeah.
And she did say at that time, she said, you might possibly
Be on it for
have
life.
to live with that blood clot. Anyway, you went off and had the ultrasound done, and
So what happened in the ultrasound?
Well, they had an operator come out and wave the wand over my arm, and she did that for about several minutes. And she had a bit of a frown on her face. I said, "Oh, what's the matter?" And she said, "Oh, I couldn't find anything." And then she called her colleague over, and the colleague had a go at me for a few minutes, and they couldn't find it either. So I didn't say anything because I was waiting for the report, the formal report that came out, and that came out the next morning. And it said basically that there was no blood clot there. So the Lord had healed me, and that meant that I could go off my blood thinners and the opioid-based painkiller. So that was just an amazing blessing.
And the interesting thing about that is that Pastor Robbie Kerwood came to visit, and his wife, Tracy, came to visit us in hospital a number of times. And on one occasion, he actually laid hands on the arm and prayed for the blood clot to be gone. And so praise the Lord, that prayer worked.
Isn't that amazing? I don't even remember that.
Yeah, no. But that was really wonderful. So that was a terrific blessing, because you don't see a blood clot of that size disappear overnight.
No, I've actually I've had a few. I've had a similar example myself, and we've had some other people who've been healed of similar. It's amazing. The Lord, where the doctors say, no, that's you're going to be like that for the rest of your life. And so that's amazing. Wow.
I know that I'd been seriously injured, but it wasn't until I left the hospital and I read my discharge report and spoke to various health professionals that I realised just how close to death I'd actually come, and permanent disability as well. Every doctor that I've seen expresses shock at how amazing my recovery has been. And in fact, the orthopaedic surgeon that Brenda mentioned earlier, she was reading my hospital report before I came in to see her, and she didn't know what to expect. And when I walked in under my own steam and was able to interact with her in a normal way, she was astounded at how well I was, and she couldn't believe it, could she?
No. And even the neurologist that we saw, 3 or 4 weeks ago in Sydney, he, a number of times during the hour-long appointment that we had with him, he kept shaking his head and kept saying, "You're a very fortunate man. You're a very fortunate man." Because, he obviously deals with all sorts of injuries, and given the situation that Nick had been in, he couldn't believe it. And he basically took him through a whole lot of tests and whatever. And at the end of the consultation, he said, "Look, I don't need to see you anymore."
Wow, that's amazing.
It's interesting. One of our friends is a retired critical care nurse, and she told us that my recovery is nothing short of a miracle, and that I am what her colleagues refer to as a 1%er. That is, those fortunate ones that recover after an accident like mine and are able to lead normal lives. So I just reckon that's an amazing testimony.
It is, yep.
I know lots of 1%ers in the Lord.
That's right.
Well,
0.1%ers, 1%ers.
Yeah.
Right? We certainly do defy the odds of
We
the
do.
medical industry, don't we?
Absolutely,
The
we do.
Lord is certainly gracious
The
for
Lord
us
is
there.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Absolutely
you
amazing.
know, I'm playing 18 holes of golf each week now. And when I first got out of hospital, even though I could walk, I couldn't even lift my arms above my shoulders. But thanks to a bit of physiotherapy and exercise, I've been able to do that now, and I can swing the club and drive the ball further than any of my colleagues. So that's very satisfying. Praise the Lord for that.
Well, you know, sitting here and seeing you now, it's hard to, I cannot imagine that you were ever injured. It seems extraordinary. Yeah.
Well, it is a very humbling experience, but it also gives me a great opportunity to tell my friends and associates who don't know anything about God or the life that I lead, and it's been a tremendous opening and given me an opportunity to say things which I normally wouldn't have been able to say, and I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah. Why is it a humbling experience?
Well, the fact that, you know, I had people not only in around Australia but overseas that were praying for me, and just the level of care and regard for my condition and genuine concern and you know, them expressing just wonderful confidence and happiness that I'm in such good shape.
Yeah.
And that's very humbling. And I'm certainly very grateful to God for that. You know, that He chose me with His grace to heal me is just extraordinary.
Do you ever wonder why He didn't take you?
Well, I do, and I wonder whether He's got something in mind for me. And, you know, that's a bit of something that I'm really praying about, to see, well, Lord, now that you've healed me, what would you like me to do?
I must say, though, there's probably hasn't been a day since that accident that I haven't personally been able to say something to somebody.
Yeah.
It's been a terrific opportunity to talk about the Lord.
Absolutely.
It's just been so wonderful. So I sort of think, if nothing else, it's given us a really good opportunity to talk to so many different people.
I've heard other people say the same when they've gone through something really traumatic, and whether it be an accident like this or suffering with mental ill health or something else, that at the end of it they go, it was hard to go through, but the peace of the Lord was there, and I now have something that I can use, and I thank the Lord that I now have this testimony to tell to others. I think that gives encouragement to people who are going through something right now, that at the end of this, when the Lord steps in, when the Lord provides a miracle, when the Lord heals you or provides for you in a way that you can't see right now, that there's an opportunity there for you to tell all of the wondrous things that God's done for them. So it's amazing.
It is incredible. Absolutely. And that's the thing, we don't seek the hard times. No one wants an accident. No one wants something bad to happen to them. But we have the Lord along for the ride with us.
Yeah.
And we just have to hang on to the Lord.
Yeah, that scripture, rejoice in the Lord always.
Absolutely.
It's not rejoice in the Lord only when things are going well or when you haven't been hit by a car, right? It's rejoice in the Lord always, and an amazing thing that is. Well, thank you so much for sharing your testimony. Thanks for dinner as well. That was wonderful.
Oh, well, it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. Yep.
All right. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I certainly did enjoy listening to that story and seeing what God has done for Nick and Brenda. Is so amazing. Nick referenced a few other people in this podcast, and I've got their stories to tell you as well. And so if you look in your podcast app, you usually scroll up or down or across, you'll find there's some notes to the episode. You'll see some links in there, or you can go to the webpage revivalontheairtoday.com, look for Nick's episode, and you'll be able to scroll down and find the other stories in there as well. You can also find lots and lots and lots of other miraculous stories, people healed of cancer, of depression, of debilitating anxiety. Just amazing stories that just show that God's power is alive on this earth today. I hope you enjoyed that, and stay tuned. Hit that follow or subscribe button on your podcast app so you don't miss any other episodes that we've got coming up, and we've got some crackers. Until next time, God bless.